the greatest drag anchor on all our global economies will be physical inactivity.
The establishment of that pillar around mass participation, where did it come from?
Road is one of the few global activities where people can take part and say they were in the field with the best of the best. One of the biggest challenges I confronted delivering an Olympic Games was the operational integration. London is a complicated city. A large part of the success of the Australian track and field team, it's been exponential, has been because of the use of AI.
You're one of only 2 or 3 people ever who have been at the top of their sport and ended up running that sport.
People were prepared to follow me when I said unpopular, uncomfortable things. Wrong is wrong, even if everyone's doing it, and right is right, even if no one's doing it.
Welcome back to Pioneers, where we go behind the scenes with some of the greatest experience operators on the planet and some of the people who have had the greatest experiences that you possibly can have as a human. Today we're joined by Lord Coe. Seb Coe has clearly done both of those things, being the architect behind London 2012 and also breaking multiple world records and Olympic champions and becoming Olympic champion on the track. We're going to start off talking about Seb's life as an athlete and look back into those glory, heady days of setting records. We'll then talk about the relationship between business and sport and what learnings he's taken forward, but also where there's been differences. And then we'll go deep on how mass participation is now a big pillar of the World Athletics strategy and really sort of talk to other organisers about how they can be part of what World Athletics is trying to achieve. Seb, I have the huge privilege of being good mates with a couple of your wonderful children.
I'm sorry about that.
I will. That's great. Alice will be listening from the start line. It'll be brilliant. We're 20 seconds in and Seb's already giving me abuse. We obviously in our generation know you mainly as politician and administrator, which is probably 2 terms you don't necessarily love, but you've done an incredible job with. But want to go back to the racing days, and it's been so fun, like going back and looking at that generation and the period of time there. So if we go back to 79, obviously the 3 world records in 41 days, like, what did that feel like at the time, and how has the memories of those times changed over the intermediate sort of 46 years?
Well, the 3 records in 41 days came really quite suddenly and frankly unexpectedly, because it was the year I graduated. I'd slithered my way to a sort of economics and finance degree, done little or no work, and then I sort of had to, graduated, and then I sort of had to focus on the rest of the season. I remember I got invited to Oslo for the first time. It was sort of, you got invited to Oslo, you thought you'd come of age. It had already had 60 world records. And I went down to the track a day before, and I ran some 200s that were remarkably quick. I'd hardly trained, as I'd been sort of trying to cram at the last minute. And I rang my old man, who's my coach, and I said, look, I'm actually feeling quite good. I think I ran some 200s in training in sort of 21 and bits, 22. And he said, look, just run out tomorrow as hard as you can and as fast as you can. And wherever you blow up in the 800, we know that's the delta that we have to work on for the rest of the season. And he didn't actually come to the race because we had a family business and, everybody was hands to the pump in that. And I had the great pleasure that night of breaking the world record. Nobody knew who I was. Everybody left the stadium. I had to get a taxi to the reception that was being held in my honour. And I got to one of the empty press areas where the old telephones were still plugged in. And I picked up the phone and I rang through to the factory where my dad was working. And I said, to his secretary, lovely lady, I said, Mabel, the name was. I said, Mabel, is my dad around? And she went, well, I think he's left the factory. So I said, well, just check in the car park to see if his car's still there. And she said, oh, yeah, it's still there. So I said, I know where he'll be. He'll be down in the basement with the engineers. And she said, well, I can't really disturb him down there. And to be honest, there isn't a telephone. So I said, well, she said, can I give him a message? And I said, yeah. I said, will you tell him that his son has just broken the 800-metre world record? She went, yeah, okay, good, yeah, right, well, I hope we see you soon. And I said, yeah, okay.
You're like,
and that
hey,
was,
well, this is quite a big deal.
No, I didn't. That was the exchange. There was no point in trying to explain it. And the message got down then. To cut a long story short, he was always designing bits of equipment and machinery. He was an engineer. That was his first love. And when he got told, he dropped a big lump of metal on his foot. And when we sold the business back in the 80s, the machine that he designed went with the company to Birmingham. And 15 years later, it was still known as the Jesus Christ machine, because that was the oath that he shouted out as he dropped this lump of metal on his foot at the news I'd broken the 800-metre world record. Then 10 days later, they got excited and invited me back to Oslo, and I then broke the mile, which was probably even less expected because I was against John Walker and Thomas Wessinghager, Dave Morgan, the best of the best. Yeah. And I thought, well, I'm going to get chewed up after a couple of laps. I'd only run 1 mile or 1,500 metres for the previous 4 years per year, so it wasn't a distance I was particularly familiar with. And I remember getting halfway through the race and thinking, the only time I've really ever thought that. Well, I've thought that twice. Once was in an Olympic final, believe it or not. And I went, this feels so easy. Do I have enough balls to go and take it to the finishing line, which I did. That got me across the line. So I broke the mile. And then at the reception afterwards, I sat with some track historians who said, you do know that nobody's ever held the 8, the mile and the 15 at the same time. And I thought, oh, God. So I then went to Zurich, and it was the hardest one. It was the one they choreographed. They gave me pacemakers and everything. And I got across the line, but it was actually, of the 3, it was the toughest. And that was the year. It was very unexpected and not the best way to go in with little or no expectation into an Olympic year the following year. So in a way, it was great to break them, but it put a lot more pressure on me for Moscow.
It feels so at odds with everything I know of you and of your dad, and the meticulous planning and sort of the real removal of any issue. And you're obviously the first athlete really to have that backroom team and everything which was there. How much of that underpreparedness, or the sort of like raw exuberance of youth, where you just didn't really consider the limits, do you think played into the fact that you could break it?
Don't confuse two things, because by the time I'd got to break those world records, I'd been doing that for the best part of 11 years.
Yeah.
And there was nothing that I hadn't done in training that I wasn't fully prepared for in a race. So although the year, the few months lead up to graduation was a pretty sketchy period of training, there was still a lot of work that had gone in before that, and I'd made it through the ranks. And there is another element that I think is really important, that I've always followed 2 really simple principles. The first is surround yourself with people that are far smarter than you are and are optimistic, and I had a great backroom team led by him, and all that work was being done at that point. And the other one is, where possible, say yes. So I got invited to do the mile when I probably, if I'd looked at it logically, I might well have said no because I wasn't experienced at the distance, but I did say yes. And I thought, well, the opportunity to get in there. So always say yes, and if you've got a really smart group of people around you, then you reduce the odds of failure.
I love that say yes thing, because I was in, very kindly, Branson had me out to Necker end of last year, and he has obviously the same.
That?
I know, terrible. Probably cut that one out. But he has the same very much like say yes to everything thing. But what I found in business, when I look at the elite athletes now, so much of it is about the stuff you say no to. And you've sort of spoken before around the fact that you did try to have a bit more balance in life. You'd never taken a supplement. You sort of had the Italian Mediterranean diet. You would have a glass of wine or a beer or whatever with dinner, although obviously not the night before races.
Well, certainly not during the race.
I don't know, it might be the new big thing. Like, go.
Well, we've had hydration stops in bloody football.
yeah, exactly. That's what we needed.
In air conditions.
We just needed a beer during the hydration break.
In air-conditioned stadiums with a retractable roof. Am I the only one that sees the weirdness of that?
Yeah. It's almost like they wanted a new sponsor placement. Like,
or maybe advertising.
Maybe they wanted...
Maybe
surely.
That, yeah.
Would FIFA do that? Surely not.
No, I mean, the next thing you'll hear is be a halftime show that lasts 35 minutes.
I know, extraordinary.
Crazy.
So, yeah, ridiculous.
We're going to lose that as well, I guess.
That can definitely stay. When you look at talking to young pro athletes now, of that whole like say yes attitude, when so much of their lives are so controlled and so much of your life was controlled, how do you balance that need to focus to be the very, very, very best, but then also the attitude towards actually wanting to experiment?
I think what I've noticed of late, and probably for the last 20 years, and I guess, look, I suppose in a way it's a slight criticism. I think far too many athletes are focused on what they do on the training track without recognising that it is a means to an end.
Yeah.
And that, the end is racing. And racing is putting yourself up against the best, and sometimes on occasions where you're not at your best. I'll tell you who is, and I absolve completely of that, is Noah Lyles.
Yeah.
Noah will go in against anybody. I was with Lance Baumann this time last year, just before the Diamond League in London. I had supper with him the night before, and he said, this is a real risk. Noah is taking a risk here because I know he's not in fantastic shape. And he's going up against, Letsile and, Simbini and the guys that are running faster than he is at the moment. But he wants to race. And there are other athletes who have got extraordinary talent. I just wish I could see more of them. And that doesn't really help us build the profile of the sport. So we need more Noahs, and we need more Jakob Ingebrigtsens out there and Faith Kipyegons than we want those that are sort of just focused more on their training and playing it. Look, I never went into races with a cavalier attitude, but I also knew there were moments that I actually quite liked challenging myself, because I knew that I probably wasn't in great physical shape, but I had enough street smarts to win a race. And sometimes you get that challenge. I think actually, I've never discussed this with Noah, I think Noah likes to be in a situation of jeopardy to find out whether he can actually navigate his way through, and he normally does.
I just love,
unlike the England football team.
Let's just lob on more defenders. Definitely not that attitude. Because within that specific part, I love hearing you talk about the way you raced, like 800 meters, I think, hardest distance of any racing distance.
It's the most complicated. Yeah. Physiologically, I think it is provably the toughest.
Yeah.
But it is also the most complicated, because if you think about it, it's the first race you start in lanes outside of relays or the sprints, but you then break at 100 and whatever it is, 10 meters. And then you've got to figure out how you address the bottom bends, whether you go tangential. If you're in lane 7 or 8, you've got stuff going on inside you, which you can't always see. And I never remember, I competed at a time I didn't have the benefit of the big screens where you could look up and see what was going on behind. If you're on the inside lane, you really don't want to get absolutely swallowed up by a field that comes over. And you're fighting for, 9 or 10 people are fighting for a space that's not much bigger than the platform we're standing on here. And it's all about exit strategies. It's about trying to figure out that, if I'm sitting 3 sides away from that boom mic and I've got it right, then I probably judge the distance. If it's 4 strides, then that 1 stride is probably what I'm going to lose the race by. And then you've got to really pile it on between what I call the killing zone, which is between 500 and 600, because how you 7 times out of 10, how you come out of that 500 to 600 meter space is the order you go into the finishing bend, and the order you go into the finishing straight is often the way it finishes. So there's a hell of a lot going on. And by the way, physiologically, you can only absorb about 20% of the oxygen you need to cover the distance when you're going sub 143, 142 and a half. It's the hardest event on the track.
And it's like because I love the way you've always spoken about that kill zone, because it just watching all of your races back, it is pure racing. Like some of the times, like you obviously had the kick that sometimes you'd be like, okay, I'll go and rely on that. Sometimes you're like, I'm just going to go out super, super hard and go and try and go out as quickly as you can. When you look at the road racing now, you look at the marathon, we're obviously a couple of months post London and both Zawa and Kajaucha breaking two. It looks like Kiplimo's trying to go out for that at Chicago this year. Do you feel like any of that has become like lost on the road side? Whereas like everything is right. We are going through, I had dinner with Hugh Brasher a couple of nights before London, and we knew what they were going out at halfway at. And so it's just really like, it does become the training and the pacing and really like, it is, I know this is the time I'm going to go and run.
To go back to your original point, I think it's true, but only to a certain degree. Yeah, there were moments when in a final, I would think I'm feeling really good and it doesn't really matter what I do, I'm going to win this race. So, you know, I can sit in because I know that I can run 21 and bits for 200 and, you know, I was 44 and something relay runner. But there were other occasions where I thought I can also take this from the front and, you know, close the door quickly. But it wasn't always as random as that, because often the tactic that I would choose would be directly related to who was in the field. So if I thought there were loads of kickers in that field that, without being too disrespectful, were just sort of jumped up 400-meter runners trying to get lucky on the day, then you hit them with everything you've got in the killing zone. If you know that they are good, strong 800-meter runners, but they don't have that change of pace, then the last thing you want to do is to set the pace, because they are more vulnerable to you kicking with 110, 120 meters. And by the way, twice a week, winter and summer, I would do nothing but speed drills on the track. So my old man, whether it was at Battersea or George Gandy at Loughborough, would stand in the middle of the arena. And it didn't matter what training schedule I was doing. If I heard the whistle, I had to sprint until they blew that whistle. And so there was a lot of learnt rote involved in my training. So it wasn't quite as random as that. But I think that, to answer your question in full, yeah, I think some of that has been lost a little on the road. And, you know, you've now got pacemakers in track have been helpful to overall times and progress, but sometimes they have taken away the actual racing nature of it. I see athletes that sort of predicate their success on finishing 7th and 8th with a personal best. And that's not how I saw it. I really didn't care what time I ran as long as I got across the line first. And I think that the pacemakers have probably denuded some of the experience for fans because it's become a little bit predictable. And of course, the pacemakers are helping those that have probably got those qualities to make it even more predictable. But the nice thing about Olympic finals or Olympic games is it's nice to watch those athletes that rely very heavily on pacemakers looking completely at sea when it becomes tactical. They don't know what they're doing out there. And actually, that's why championship racing, I think, is so much more interesting than maybe the choreographed one-day meetings, because you really see the people that have got good racing brains. And, you know, that's for me is the distinguishing feature.
Are you considering anything? I mean, conversation is going to go all over the place because there's everything I want to dive into and all of these things. Are you considering anything from the governing body side to make things this like pure DNA racing better for fans? Like,
yeah, look, I chair the Diamond League, and we have these discussions. And actually, a lot of the great race promoters of the past, the Wilfred Meerts, the Andreas Brugers, the Sven Arne Hansens, the Arne Hauptviks, the people that have put meetings on and got great races have rarely just gone to the ranking list and gone, I want the top 10. They're like impresarios, they're choreographers. They don't necessarily want everybody that is going to be in the top 10. They want people, the good ones knew how to create an exciting race. They didn't want 8 Seb Coes or Steve Ovets or Steve Scotts. They wanted it to be mixed up. And Andries Brugger was absolutely a classic at that. So was Sven-Arne Hansen. They didn't just go and say, right, well, we're going to get the 10 fastest athletes and we'll get a great race, because you don't always get that. It can become quite cagey. So making sure putting a race field together is as much an art as it is a science. I mean, I guess it's like casting for a movie.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want everybody being the same. You need colour, you need depth, you need structure. And that's what good race promoters manage to achieve. And so we have discussed that. And actually, there is a lot less pacemaking than there used to be. Although the pace lights I actually really welcome, because that adds understanding, so that when people are watching the race, they know what the European record is, they know what the world record is, they know if somebody's going for a personal best, whether they're in front or behind. And I think that lends understanding. And everything our sport can do, it's particularly in the stadium, because it's a complicated sport, particularly for people watching it for the first time. Anything we can do to lend understanding, I think, is hugely important.
Because so many people here and listening will be all the big mass participation organisers and everything around that side. And when we apply all of those lessons to the road, like the same thing is happening in road marathons, where there's this almost sort of like myopic obsession with, well, record paces, and obviously 2 hours was a huge thing, and now that's sort of gone. There's a little bit of a movement away from that. But there isn't really the same level of purity of obsession over the racing itself. Like, we've seen this crazy stat now that as the interest in participating in mass participation races obviously exploded. Like, we had to say no to over 1 million people in the London Marathon last week.
I think it was 1.3, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 1.35 million ends, and obviously amazing to have 2 days, 100,000 people get in, but that's still 1.25 million people that we had to, I didn't personally email all of them, but we had to email saying they hadn't got in. At the same time...
It's a high-class problem, by the way, to have.
Yeah, we're not complaining. It is a nice problem to have. But the interest in the elites, I think, has really waned. Like, we've seen the stats as far as, if you look at the percentage of people who are interested in the elite racing or participating, 5 years ago that was about 25%. Now it's about 6%. So there's a much lower interest on the elites, and part of it is, Paula was here yesterday talking about with super shoes, the fact that, like, actually maybe it really benefited her not having super shoes, because she could grunt it out in the last 10K with dead legs and when everyone else was blowing up around her, whereas now it's much more predictable. You don't have destroyed bodies in the same way because the foam's so good and you get the feedback from the plates. How do you think, looking at the road, we can get back into a point of view where there's more of an obsession over the racing and the entertainment and the joy there than this, I'm just going to run these perfect...
Well, let me approach that initially from a point you've raised. Actually, we're very conscious about the regulation around shoes. It's really only been in the last 6 or 7 years. We have finally got a unit in World Athletics that's making these judgments. And look, it's never going to be an exact science, and you know, I'm a great believer that you don't stifle innovation. No civilization has done particularly well if you've tried to close down civilization. We're having the same arguments in a way around AI at the moment, and you know, there are navigable routes through. And we're working very closely with the road shoe business, the shoe companies, the coaches, the athletes, and the majors. I'm always a bit cautious about writing talking about the progress of a sport entirely around one technological facet.
Yeah.
You know, if you speak to Lance Baumann or you speak to any of the top coaches, they take a very different view. They'd say, actually, I'm a pretty good coach.
Quite hard.
Yeah, I work pretty hard. I know what I'm doing. And, you know, Noah is, I'm sure Noah's running in shoes that were faster and better designed biomechanically, engineering-wise than I was. But good coaching is still for me, good coaching pretty much sits at the centre of this. Are the shoes important? Yes. Are they more important? Probably than they were 10 or 12 years ago. But, you know, I've been involved in this marketplace for a long time. I've yet to see a shoe company that employs researchers and R&D teams to design shoes that make you go slower. It just doesn't sort of work in the marketplace. So it's a challenge, and as a regulator at World Athletics, we have a responsibility to make sure that, you know, energy return and all the other, you know, technological developments. But we mustn't also forget that alongside the work that's going into, you know, creating better performances for the shoes is also giving longevity to the career of the athletes, because there's a lot of biomechanical and engineering work that's going. And I chose to be with the shoe company I went to simply because my old man, who was an engineer, took the shoes apart and came back to me and he said, "I'm not your agent, I'll never be your agent, but I'm telling you, if I'm going to set the schedules that you're going to have to do for the next 3 or 4 years, I think you're safer in those shoes than you are that brand." He said, "It's up to your agent to decide the best deal you can get, but that's what I'm going to tell you." So that's always been the case. But I do think that crowds do love head-to-heads. They love to see people jostling. They like to see jeopardy. They like to see unpredictability. And they also like, you know, they want to be in a stadium when a bit of history is made and, you know, somebody breaks eventually, as they will, 140 and, you know, all those sorts of things. But my instinct is they go home excited and invigorated because they just see really great red-blooded competition.
With the unit, there is obviously judgment call. I take the point on not stifling innovation, and we're obviously hugely involved in the AI side, and Sam Altman was our sort of first big institutional investor through Y Combinator. I think in the wider AI community at the moment, there is a general opinion that regulation has not done enough and has not sort of kept up with where things are. Was there anything of looking at London, particularly like Sarway? I think we always thought that was there, but like look at Kajelcha, he missed 2 bottles, like no pedigree yet on the road, running his debut. Was there any feeling for you or any call to the unit which was like, not sure whether we've got the bar right?
Well, first of all, I think I slightly disagree with the premise you've just set, because I don't think AI is going to be the human response to everything, and AI is the connective tissue that allows you, for instance, in training, talent identification. You know, 20 years ago, we were sending hundreds of people out into the field to identify maybe in developing countries 2 or 3 competitors. You can now do that. Australia has used AI. A large part of the success of the Australian track and field team in the last 5 or 6 years, and it's been exponential, has been because of the use of AI, their coaches being able to identify talent and also bespoke training programs, at resource allocation, all these things that can be properly used. But it's not it's not as all-embracing as I think people think. So, look, you said, could we have done more earlier? Yeah, we probably could have done. I'm going back into the history of my presidency. You know, in 2015, I had 17 policemen in the office after the 2015 crisis, you know, from the previous regime. It took me 4 years to get the right governance structures in place and the athletic integrity unit. The next 4 years of my presidency was about letting those things embed. Now we're in that phase where we're beginning to grow and evolve and figure out how we remain salient and exciting in the lives of young people and all the things we've actually just talked about. So would we ideally have liked to have addressed some of those things earlier? Yeah, for sure. But actually, the first 4 years was putting out the fire. The second 4 years was trying to figure out what had been left and what we could create out of that. So the focus now on innovation, and yeah, some of the regulation around shoes, but I'm a great believer that you work in a group rather than just simply litigate. It's not the computer says no. We have to recognize that a large part of the ecosystem, particularly for road and road running is 95% of our sport.
Yeah.
We are historically an international federation that has focused on track and field, which is a good thing. It's what we had to do, but my predecessors were far too slow in recognising what I was running road in the 80s. Yeah. Now, I wasn't, using it to get out on the circuit, but it was a staple part of the program and the progress I made as a track and field athlete, including cross country. So my predecessors, Primo, hated road. He got no time for it at all. But you could see what was happening. I was training in the US, in Florida and Chicago during the summer months. Every weekend there was a road race. You could see the way it was developing. I mean, we were far too slow. We're now only now really has John Ridgeon, our CEO, and our Alessio from our running, have they started to build the relationships with the marathon majors, more label races than we've ever had before. And look, over 1 billion people in the course of a month identify themselves as runners. It's a huge and burgeoning part of our sport. And I haven't even talked about mountain and trail as well, or ultra. So we recognise that is a massive part of our market. And that's where a large part of our focus and innovation and resource allocation is now devoted.
And it is, I think, so much. It's so true in the way that if they're actually on the shoe side, if there had been stifling of the innovation earlier, you would not be seeing the growth that you're seeing now.
Sure.
Like, there's no way.
I'm sorry, I'm a historian by training, if anything. There's no civilization that has prospered when you've tried to close down borders, inflict tariffs on people, trying to artificially change the direction of the marketplace. You don't do that. And our shoe companies are a huge part of that landscape. Yeah. They're not only actually investing in our sport, but if you look at the proportion of income that athletes avail themselves of outside of competition and prize money, the biggest chunk is from the shoe companies.
Totally. I remember amazing stories of the type of shoes that you were running, sort of 60, 70, 80 miles a weekend. And you can now, like, the reason that we've seen the rate of sort of mechanical injuries drop off a cliff since the new foam technology comes in. And that's allowing people to then go and do that stuff.
And that's a good welfare issue.
Yeah, 100%.
We talk about welfare, but nobody actually relates welfare and keeping athletes in training for some of the work that's done around, shoe tech in all the big shoe companies.
We were saying exactly, I heard with Adidas last week with Patrick Nava and Marc, myself, the guys who built all of that Adidas line of shoes. They were saying the same thing. They were like, all of that volume that's being able to now be done by people in the pack and in the masses, all of that is coming from that innovation. When you came to our office about 4 or 5 years ago and sat down with all the World Marathon majors, and there was this sort of incredible moment then that they were all astonished that you would come, as far as saying sort of like, wow, World Athletics really does care about us, having not cared. And you see where like Alessio is present at everything now. Like he's been amazing at just sort of like always being there. Was the establishment of that pillar around mass participation, was it something which is like, actually, this is fundamental to us staying relevant as a governing body, given, road running's growing at about 5x the rate that track is. Where did it come from?
Partly that, partly my recognition that road is important, and it was important to me. I used to run road relays. I ran the Rome half marathon the day after I won the World Cup. I was on a Frascati loading diet with Brendan Foster one night, and we both decided we'd do it.
I've had those nights with Brendan. I don't know how you did that.
Well, I ran really well, actually. I finished 9th in it, and I was, quite excited at the fact that, this 1,500-metre runner had finished 9th in an international half marathon, only to find out and sober up quite quickly that Greta Weitz was 2 minutes ahead of me at the end of the race. It was a sobering moment. So there was that element, was I did understand road, and I understood the importance of it, and having spent a lot of time in the US, I could see the way that the US market was actually moving away from track and field and into road. But you've also got to understand, going back even further, my quasi-political sport council background, because I was one of the founding members of the the Health Education Authority. So even then, when I was deputy chair of the UK Sports Council, I was forming relationships with health organisations through government to get them to understand that we were the best bridgehead into meeting some of their own health challenges about obesity and childhood inactivity. And for me, participation has always it's not just been about getting more people running on the road, it's about getting people into patterns of physical exercise, because the greatest drag anchor on all our global economies will be physical inactivity. I mean, the stark statistic in the UK is that between roughly the age of 8 and 11, the average child in the UK loses 50% of physical activity on a yearly basis. Now, if you extrapolate forward to mid-30s, it's not a surprise that our health authorities are now dealing with ailments and pathologies that they probably weren't dealing with, until people were in their 50s and 60s. So that is a massive challenge. And so putting our sport, what I wanted to do was to make it really clear to health organisations, governments, local, national and international, that there is no sport that is better placed to help them with their health ambitions. And so that's why I pushed as hard as I could for participation. And to answer a question you asked some minutes ago, I think the reason that the participation scales have risen is, first of all, there's a great deal more understanding about health-related activity, health-related fitness. But also, remember, there are very, very few sports where a participant can set off and say they were in the same field as somebody that went on to break a world record or as a reigning Olympic champion. That's unusual. You don't, get your weekend golf clubs out and saunter around at the back of the British Open. You don't end up at Wimbledon saying, well, I had a good go. I sort of got past the first round. But actually, road is one of the few global activities where people can take part and say they were in the field with the best of the best.
How do you build that next S-curve? Because when we dive deep into, the UK is now the fastest growing mature market in road globally. We look at a lot of those influences, and a lot of that does come back to work that you've done. 2012 growth off the back of that. A lot of the policy that we put in place, Hugh Brasher and the London Marathon team, is a load of sort of influencing factors which have driven that. We're at this top of this massive boom where we do have a problem of supply, where it would be amazing if those 1 million people can run London Marathon, but given you've obviously spoken about politics and sport always being inextricably linked, and it's been so much work to get the 2 days London Marathon, we're not going to be able to do that again. How do you think about trying to stop this boom from being curtailed by really governmental problems of not being able to close enough roads in these core cities to get enough people on those start lines? Where's that next growth coming from?
Look, I'm not going to be coy or naive about it. One of the biggest challenges I confronted delivering an Olympic Games was exactly the operational integration. London is a complicated city. You can't run very much east of Tower Bridge, because if you do, then you're closing bridges that will bring London to a standstill. And no city can do that. So look, there are always compromises that have to be made. I do think that having event strategies that can be driven through governmental organisations, health authorities, local authorities, is one of the easiest and probably the quickest way of trying to get people into physical activity, telling them to go out and do, you have your couch to 5K, you have lots of online stuff, that's great. But actually getting people out together. That's why I love parkrun.
Yeah.
Parkrun is one of the most important social developments since we had the Clean Air Acts back at the late 50s. It's been extraordinary to watch that, and that's why the COVID years were so damaging to parkrun, where I think we went down from 50 runs to about 5 in London at a time where you were really encouraging people to be outdoors and fitter. So we've got to do more to incentivise through tax systems, through local breaks, through organisations, to make sure that we have these events. And yeah, sometimes bureaucracy does get in the way, and I hope that people recognise that having a fit, healthy nation, particularly setting patterns of behaviour early, is actually a national saving. It's not a cost.
What can you do? You're one of only whatever 2 or 3 people ever who have been at the top of their sport and ended up running that sport and being so successful on both sides of those fence. You're bringing all of the mass participation organisers together in Copenhagen to have this sort of area. A lot of those organisations...
Well, we're using it off the back of the World Road Running
yeah.
Championships, and which is a great idea. And I've always said, even to the Diamond League guys, and we now do that routinely, if you have your Diamond League event, try and build a participation program, or try and build a set of seminars where you've got people under the same roof that have got commonalities and interests to drive some of these forces and changes.
Because how have you gone through that exact transition? Like, when people speak about you as an athlete, it is you were an aggressive hunter, kill zones, didn't always get on brilliantly with your rivals and that kind of stuff, and then you've become this incredible...
You've never seen me in the council chamber.
I would love to. You've become this incredible sort of connector of, I mean, one of my favourite stories with you was when we were at the track, New Balance track in Boston like 4 years ago, and we were walking around backstage, and it must have been 200 people, 90% of the people you knew exactly who they were, you knew their kids, you knew everything, superpower I've never seen before. What did you learn from those days of like, sort of essentially like all-out aggression athlete to being able to be someone who can work alongside councils and governments and things?
Do you know where a large part of that was developed? When I became a Member of Parliament.
Really?
You walk through your constituency. I was Member of Parliament in Cornwall for Falmouth and Campbell. You walk down Falmouth High Street on a Saturday when you've done your surgeries and you don't recognise the guy that runs the newsagents or his family, and you don't know their names, you've lost a vote. It's as simple as that. So I am actually interested in people. I like to know how they live their lives. I guess it's partly what drew me into politics. And I like to think I went into politics for the right reason. I didn't need it for profile. I certainly didn't need it to lose, when I was competing, I like to think that most of the country wanted me to win unless they lived in Brighton. But when you became a Member of Parliament, you had to accept the fact that 50% of people didn't actually approve of you to start off with. And learning to recognise that, but making sure that everybody felt that you had their interests and you were interested in them, you had their interests at heart and you were interested in them, was actually a really important element of that. And it's the way I tended to... When I was in politics, I wasn't tribal. I'm guessing that's why I've just been made chair of the Mayoral Development Corporation in a strongly socialist area by a socialist mayor of Manchester who's just to become our Prime Minister. I was never tribal. And I went through the London years. When London was bidding and the cities and the International Olympic Committee came through London, I absolutely made sure they didn't just sit down with Tony Blair as the Prime Minister. And Blair was a grown-up politician. He understood that having Michael Howard, leader of the Conservative Party, and Charlie Kennedy, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, in the same cabinet room so that they met with the leadership, political leadership of the UK, not just one factional element of it, was hugely important. I even managed to get all 3 parties to sign off on the same 5 sentences in the manifesto in 2005, the year we were bidding to win the Games, with the same words, knowing that if one of them prevailed, the other 2 couldn't siphon off and say, well, we didn't agree to it. Well, it was in your manifesto. So I think having been a politician, and particularly one of the skill sets that people tend to overlook about members of Parliament, who are overwhelmingly hardworking and in it for the right reasons, believe it or not, is that you have to have an interest in local people. And I've always tended to try to be as empathetic as I can to even arguments that I thoroughly disagree with, but try to put myself in those shoes. And I like to think if I've got any skill at all, it's bringing people together. It's not allowing them to fester in their own corners of interest.
And it has been incredible to to sort of witness that willingness to be incredibly opinionated, whether it's been on gender or any of the other options, whilst also doing that collection. I mean, going from flying in the face of Margaret Thatcher and Moscow and being like, no, we're going to go, despite no support, to then going and obviously being an MP for the same party like years later. You mentioned Burnham, who's going to be taking over as probably as we record this. The politics of the UK is so typified by party politics and being stratospherically left or right, and the same things. I think there's a lot of us who wished you were running the IOC now and some of the challenges which were there. If you were picking up Burnham's job on Monday when he's sworn in by the King, how would you go about trying to solve that problem of like really actually getting back to the basis of like empathy for people and avoiding what you've always fought against in sport of this huge party opinion?
Well, I think, where would I start? I think you've got to be your own person, and you've got to recognise that not everything you're going to do is going to meet with approval, and it may take longer. And there are things that I put in place that I know are probably not going to be beneficial or obviously beneficial for the sport for another 10 years when I've been well off the scene. The one thing I would say at the moment in politics is that I think the level of political discourse is at the lowest level that I've ever witnessed. You know, I was in the House for only 5 years. I was a minister for a short period of time, a senior government whip. And there was a level of respect across the chamber that isn't there now. And it has become unnecessarily tribal, and I think the language has become too violent, and I think it has switched people off politics. So the only advice I would give to anybody in that role is do what you can to try and make the case as strongly as you can without it becoming personal. And I spoke not that long ago to John Major about that, and we both agreed that, you know, he was my boss. He appointed me. And, you know, even Margaret, in her most combative years, was respectful of the chamber and respectful of other people. And I look at both sides of the political divide, and I just think we've lost that recently, and that's something I hope we can get back.
And there is a sort of pseudo-Trump effect. You look at what happened with Thomas Bach at the IOC, or we were also talking earlier about FIFA. This isn't just happening in the UK Parliament. This is almost happening in the majority of the power structures that we see across the world. If we are going to try to get back to an example of time where you have more tolerance, respect, and that attempt to listen, understanding other people's opinions, and you look at your sort of children's generation coming through, and hopefully soon to be grandchildren generation coming through, what do you think is our best hope to try and get back there?
It's a very old-fashioned view, and I'm probably going to sound old-fashioned, but that comes from leadership at the top. Leadership is not, you know, it's not a status above a door. It's consistent behaviour. And you have to have politicians that are going to set the tone and the style. And look, I don't go as far as to say that the House of Commons is too combative. Actually, it's quite a good thing. You know, I think, you know, I've watched parliaments around the world that are frankly just rather super. Well, it's watching paint dry. At least you can have a good debate. But I think there is clearly a balance, and I think we've lost that in the last few years.
On leadership, you're obviously coming to the end of your third term at World Athletics, and on behalf of everyone in running, we are incredibly grateful for everything you've done for the sport. It has been a ludicrously successful period of time for the sport, and so many of us only get to have the businesses that we do and get to work in the sport that we love because of the work that so many people like you have done. What do you hope people remember about your tenure, and what legacy do you want to leave?
That's for others. I'm certainly not going down that road. But what I would say, it's been a team effort. I've had a remarkably good team around me. I've got John Ridgeon, who's a world champion, silver medalist, and very smart guy. I've got some really smart directors, and people were prepared to follow me when I said unpopular, uncomfortable things to ourselves within the sport. We rewrote a constitution in the space of 2 years. We created the Athletic Integrity Unit that's brought back a semblance of trust and integrity to the sport. We've grown the revenues. I'm very, very proud that we are the only international federation that is now gender balanced across our governance structures. 26 council members, 13 men, 13 women. And, this isn't quotas and tokenism, this is skills. They're not there because, we're trying to make up numbers. And I'm a great believer in, having an organisation that looks like the world we live in. And it's particularly important for young people, because if they look at your organisation and they just see it full of stuffed shirts and people that are really, they're just serving time, then they find something else to do. And rarely will it be in your sector, by the way. They'll go off and find something else. So I think our sport is much more reflective of the world that young people particularly live in, but legacies for other people. I think we've worked as a really solid team, and we've made some tough decisions that, those tough decisions probably mean is the reason why I'm sitting here and not in Lausanne. But hey, that's life.
And because it is such a sort of challenging thing, which is that sort of like, it is the reason you have the misery of having to talk to me rather than being in Lausanne. And it's sort of that whole terrible saying of like, pick your battles. It doesn't feel like you've ever really lived by that. Like you've kind of sort of taken you've taken a principled stance, whatever you think the right thing was at the time. Like it was a huge risk going to Moscow. Like that could have massively blown back in your face in huge ways. Like there's many cities across the world where their Olympics has been something which has led to just complete derision of the people who are sort of like leading it. Is there any sort of is there ever a moment when you're taking these strong stances on any of the topics that we all know well, where you think, how's this going to play out in the next 5 years? Or is it always, no, this is what I believe in, this is the right thing to do, this is what we're going to go for?
I've always taken the view that wrong is wrong, even if everyone's doing it, and right is right, even if no one's doing it. And, that's how I've tended to view these situations. And, I don't expect everybody to see the world the way I do, but I don't expect people to necessarily expect me to see the world they do. And I think I've been lucky that I've had a sport or been involved in a sport that has been prepared on occasions to make some moral judgments about things, and we've done that. Whether we're right or wrong, history will test us, but I don't think we will be proven wrong.
And I don't think you have, and I think it has been really lovely in a sport to know what the sport stands for and isn't in the nature of hydration breaks, just chasing the next advertisement spot. Before we go on to the quickfire, looking at the future of road in this huge boom that's going on, if there's one thing you could get all of the mass participation organisers, you obviously know all of the majors, Jack and Hugh and everyone else incredibly well.
Yeah, they've all become good friends, actually.
Yeah, no, it's been such a privilege and joy of my life. It feels mental that sort of all these people running the most important experience in the world, you get to be incredibly good mates. If there's one thing you could get all of them to do for the good of running, what's one thing that you would look for particularly looking at the majors?
I go on doing what you're doing because it's working. You've been part of an endurance market. There's anywhere between 4 and 800 billion. 21 billion a year on events alone. They've done a remarkable job. I hope that they have the ability to continue to do that. And local authorities and all those agencies that are out there that can help them do that, whether it's local security, whether it's town planning, whether it's road closures, go on recognising that actually what they're doing is providing a social service as well as a fan experience.
Couldn't agree more. We're having this sort of conversation with Marc and Jürgen at Berlin, and just looking at the health outcomes achieved by that one singular organisation in SCC is just completely extraordinary. You mentioned parkrun as well. Right, I want to do some quick-fire questions to wrap up, and I promise that only some of these have been supplied by your children.
That's a worrying thought.
Yeah, well, you'll probably be able to tell the ones which have been supplied by your children because they make no logical sense in the context of anything else. One mass participation race you want to run yourself that you haven't run yet?
Oh, that's a good one. I ran London, run half marathons, done the Great North. I'll come back on that one.
We'll circle back round. What's the one piece of advice you give a promising young runner today?
Nothing happens quickly overnight. There'll be setbacks. It will be character forming, and use it as much for the years you're a competitor as you will do for the years you're not a competitor. There are some learnings that go way, way beyond the stadium or the road.
Amazing. 10 years from now, is 2 hours broken by the men in the same way as happened with the 4-minute mile, just pretty much every race?
Yeah, for sure, quicker than that.
How quick is, very good segue, how quick is the men's world record on the marathon in 10 years' time?
I can't say that, but it will be significantly under 2 hours.
Does a woman ever run under 2 hours for the marathon?
Yes, but not yet.
Different to Paula. Paula was like, no, never going to happen. So I'm with you.
Well, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I've just seen the extraordinary performances, even at distances that are not obviously their forte. I watched Faith Kipyegon rupture 30 minutes easily on the road for 10K just a year ago in Monaco. So I'm not so sure that a woman won't get there.
Do you think a London Marathon every weekend would be a good idea?
No.
Sorry, Hugh.
I'm only thinking of my great friend Peter Hendy at Transport for London. He would have a fit. He would have a fit if I said that's a great idea.
It's going to happen.
Sorry, Sir Peter Hendy.
Yeah. One thing today's young athletes have that you wish you'd had?
They've got so much greater access to diagnostic medicine. You know, if I thought I got a stress fracture, the brutal way of dealing with that was you lay on a physio table, the physio or the doctor ran an ultrasound, and if you had to be peeled off the ceiling, you'd got a stress fracture because it cut straight through the fissure and into the nerves. Those sorts of things. You know, you've got diagnostic treatments, diagnostic medicine that allows you to be back in training so much quicker, or at least within 30 minutes of the onset of an injury to understand what the rehab looks like. So yeah, I wish there are periods that I had to sit out of the sport that I know were longer than they should have been and would have certainly been quicker had I had that kind of MRI imaging and all the stuff that's now around.
Awesome. Your dad, the mathematician and engineer, really brought in the relentlessness of training and building backroom teams, and that led to an extraordinary growth in your performance. What do you think the next growth in performance is going to be over the next 10 years?
Returning to some of the things that he was doing 20 years ago.
Really?
Yeah. I think some of the things that he was doing have been slightly overlooked. He rewrote the playbook on middle distance. And the one thing that would improve the strength in depth of 800 is to go back to 4 rounds in 4 days in an 800. And that would really weed out the chances from the proper 800-metre runners.
Love it. I wasn't expecting that. Biggest lesson applied to business and life from sport?
Oh, just test. Be relentless in the way that you treat things. You're just a forensic eye for detail, and never ever seeing it only as a science. You know, use your intuition and be empathetic to the people around you. And when you do find the right people and they're world class, trust them, don't micromanage them.
Biggest mistake from sport that when applied to business has led you astray?
Thinking that you can come out of your career as a world record holder or an Olympic champion and go straight away at the same level into whatever you choose to do. I went from being, pretty high profile in my sport to pounding the streets in Falmouth and Camborne for 2 years to get a seat, to win a seat and then become a backbencher and go up through the ranks by, starting by carrying the bags of a minister. It's life, and it's a good training.
That is the biggest single thing we see with athletes coming to our company, which is that the really, really good ones accept that they have to relearn something new. And the people who find it really hard is they're 5 months in, it's like, why am I not the best in the world at this again? Because I just have this inheritance.
It's not going to work that way.
If you were a condiment, what would you be?
Pepper.
Oh, that's not what Alice said you'd say. She said you'd say salad cream or mustard.
Oh, salad cream. Heinz salad cream.
Heinz salad cream.
Yeah.
Okay. Alice doesn't know you as well as we thought we might do. When my mate Jack asked for your daughter's hand in marriage, for how long did you pause to reflect and think?
Probably only as long as it took me to get the next mojito, because I was on the beach at the time.
You managed to find your drug.
Very happy for both of them.
Seb, this has been brilliant. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen today. If you've missed any of our previous episodes, we've got the CEO of London Marathon, Hugh Brasher, Marc Makowski and Patrick Nava, the mother and father of the Adidas super shoe that broke all the records, and Paula Ratcliffe, obviously marathoner extraordinaire. Please do go and check those out, and thank you so much for your time.